Edith asked if I would share my own direct experience of having experienced depression. And I have to say, honestly, when Kevin was approaching this subject, and he's been with me as my partner for 22 years, and he came to the journey with depression, and that was what brought him to the journey. And he, through doing the journey work, so liberated his life that the way I got to know him is he kept wanting to come back to the journey and serve as a trainer to help Britain free itself from depression. And so I've known him not only to be, someone who's a living, breathing example of the work, but also someone whose greatest passion was to serve Britain at that time. And he barely knew me. I just kept seeing him at all the events and could see he had a great love of truth. And so we became friends, and over a period of time, then business partners, and then, well, one thing led to another. And now we're life partners, and we were married 3 years later in Maui. But when he first started to write the book, I thought, I don't know what I have to contribute. I'm not a depressive personality. I tend to be like Dutchies. And how everyone here is focused on happiness, thinking positively. It's upbeat, it's gung-ho, it's passionate. Everybody's on the move here in Holland. And I saw myself that way. And then when I was opening to begin writing for the book, I realized I actually spent 7 years of my life in an extreme shutdown. I mean, frozen in numbness. And in my own experience, when I shut down in one area, it's like I turned into an ice cube, and I was literally watching myself go through the motions of life for 7 years. And what happened was, growing up, my dad, he was diagnosed with manic depressive, so burnout and depression. And he worked for the American government, and he was a designer of the radar systems that would detect the Cuban missiles coming over. And so he was a scientist, he was a bona fide genius, creating these radars to detect missiles. And when he had designed it, he worked for the War Department with the Defense Department with General Electric. He would then be asked to go down to the Pentagon and present his radar. And if they then won the bid from the American government, they would go up to Thule, Greenland, to build this radar. Now, the truth is, my father was not a leader among men. He was a quiet genius. And they would always offer, the government would offer him a little bonus if he would take the 6 months to go up to Thule, Greenland, to build these radar systems. And inevitably, after about 6 months, we'd get the phone call from Greenland. He was in hospital again, and he'd had a nervous breakdown. And he couldn't take the stress of feeling that if he made one mistake with this radar, millions of people could die because his radar didn't detect the missiles. And he felt like he was holding all of the American safety on his shoulders. And he would always arrive home a shell of a man. And he would promise us he's not going to go up and be part of 400 people building this radar system. But every few years he'd design another radar system, and he'd end up back in Thule, Greenland, and he'd come back completely, the emptiness was crushing. I went to university when I was 18 years old, and after 3 weeks of being at university, I came back home. And my dad was just finishing designing his latest radar system. This is 1972. And so he was in this bleak, deep, dark depression. You could feel it in the house. The whole house had a pall over the house. And I remember listening late at night on the Saturday night, Dad arguing in a big row with my mum. And the next day I got up and I thought, geez, I wish I could help my dad where he was being crushed by the weight of responsibility that he felt he carried for the American people's safety. And I could feel he was just being absolutely crushed by it. And I wrote him a letter, "Dear Dad, once again I can see you're in anguish at being crushed by the weight of your responsibility. And I wish that somehow you could just trust and offer your burden up to God, that it wouldn't all be on your shoulders." And later that morning, my dad came out of his study and he was shaking like a leaf, holding this letter, looking absolutely shocked and confused and devastated. And he just looked at me and he said, "What do you mean, give my burden up to God?" And I said, "Daddy, I can just see that you're being weighted down by this burden of responsibility again. And I just wish somehow you could trust it's going to be all right, that you could give your burden up to God. But what exactly do you mean?" And his eyes looked wide and anguish-filled, and I couldn't understand what was so hard to understand. I didn't have a way to explain what I meant. And he just shook his head as if I'd asked him to do the most outrageously painful thing anyone could ask anyone. And he looked at me. Did I really mean it? Give his burden up to God? He went back into his study, and I took the bus back to university. The whole time on the bus ride, this feeling of doom is the only way I could put it. And I got to my dorm room at university, and my brother Chris called me and said, "Brandon, sit down." And I said, "Oh, don't be so dramatic." He said, "Sit down." Daddy took his perfectly designed radar into work and left it there, and he came home. And he tied a perfect knot and hanged himself. And when I heard the news, the letter came right before my eyes. Give your burden up to God. And my words were the catalyst, the final catalyst that he was looking for. And I was responsible for the death of my dad. And it was like I just froze into this ice cube. I'd killed my dad. And I went back, went through the whole funeral, couldn't cry, couldn't feel anything. I literally could not feel. I was so numbed out. And for the next 7 years, I stayed numbed out. I didn't know how to find my way back to feeling life again. It was almost like I didn't have permission from life to be allowed to feel, to enjoy life. And in that time, I graduated university, I ended up getting married, but truthfully, when I look back on it, it was like I was watching my life from a distance, going through the motions of life, trying to psych myself up, but I would call it a pseudo-happiness. It wasn't real. I was almost like performing my life. And I ended up 7 years later, and I was at I was going through an American Indian sweat lodge, working with the elders of the American Indian tradition. And this was like a spiritual camp where people were taking all kinds of courses from yoga. And there were also some spiritualists there. which had never interested me. And what happened was, I was going through these sweat lodges, and I was staying in a little cottage in this spiritual camp. And someone knocked on my door, a stranger, and he said to me, he said, "Are you Brandon?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He says, "I have a message from your father." And I said, I know you mean well. I don't actually believe in that kind of stuff. It's not my thing. And he said, "Did your father hang himself?" And that got my attention. And so I welcomed him inside. And he simply said the words, "He wants you to know it's not your fault, and that he's at peace." And he left. And it's like this big ice cube that I had become. Someone had taken a chisel and hammered it, and it cracked. And the first tears began. And it became what was a lifelong journey then, of finding my way back to feeling again, to having permission to be allowed to feel, to knowing that it was not my fault. And so, even though I look upon myself as being a very cheerful, upbeat person, I realize now, in looking back, that it was really a pseudo kind of cheerfulness, which in fact I do encounter here in Holland. That people are so upbeat, so cheerful, so happy, happy, happy. I'm even always the keynote speaker at the Happiness Festival, you know, and it is. And it doesn't surprise me really when Edith told me that of all the countries in Europe, the depression really and burnout are greatest in Holland, because that other is just, it's a play of the ego. It's a projection of what we wish were true, instead of the truth of what's really going on inside. And so, as you can imagine, ever since my dad died, one of my greatest passions in life was that I wanted to serve those who had been diagnosed with depression, who had extreme burnout, who were experiencing anxiety, like my dad, because he had that anxiety depression, where extreme anxiety and burnout followed by deep, dark depression. And I am just so grateful that the journey of everything that it works with, that of all the emotional issues and emotional shutdowns and blocks that we have, the journey method is the most successful. And I know for myself, when I first got to Australia, and they have an epidemic of young teenagers all the way to 28 years old, young adults taking their own lives. And with social media, it's even becoming fashionable because of this anxiety, depression. And I remember the first time I got there in the year 2000 with the Journey book. And I was obviously on radio shows and television shows, and I just said, listen, anyone between those ages of 18 and 28 who is experiencing depression, I will send you the book for free if you'll call into this radio station, because I've seen how powerfully liberating it is for people to finally get to the emotional root cause of what has put that surface shut down, that anxiety, that burnout in place. God knows I know what burnout is. I witnessed it my whole life as a child. And mine was just a depression that I didn't even know what an emotion was anymore. And I know a lot of people feel like they've lived in that gray zone. And my real prayer and my passion is for people to get to that emotional root cause and to liberate their lives so that they can come home to a sense of peace and wholeness inside. And I've watched this man, and it's been extraordinary over the last 23 years of our relationship. And I've watched him develop work specifically for depression. And I'm just so deeply moved by all the reports of people who, like Edith, used the work, because it first came out in Germany in Goodbye Depression, and who have absolutely freed themselves by undergoing the series of processes that are in the book that puts the whole process of liberating yourself from depression in your hands. And I truthfully feel that no one but you can know what is co-created depression and burnout. Only your own inner being could reveal that to you. So anyway, I'm going to pass it over to Kev, because this is really his book, and I'm just this adjunct.
My story notes in the book, but the work, of course, is entirely journey work adapted specifically for depression. My history was different from Brandon, because you've heard us say she did not have a natural tendency to collapse, a natural tendency to move towards depression. We'll take a look at the differences a little bit later here. My tendency was to collapse from a very early age, and I'm not going to go into the specific details here, but similarly from early on in childhood, some traumas that were so overwhelming that I didn't have the coping mechanism to handle them healthily, and got swamped emotionally. Accidents. One time I had an accident when entrusted with my young sister, baby sister, and thought I'd killed her. The pram that she was in, the buggy, went out of control, and I thought she'd died. And then, at age kind of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, no instruction as to what do you do when your emotions get that intense. How do you cope with it? And my natural tendency was to suppress, was to keep it under wraps, was to pretend everything was okay, but be secretly kind of holding on for life, dear life inside, feeling like I was weighed deeply down inside. In growing up years, in school, again, traumas with bullying, the normal sorts of things that kids go through, but my tendency definitely to collapse, to deflate emotionally, and to pretend that everything was okay. I think the kids that I was in school with would be surprised to read this book and find out that I was going through depression. But I was absolutely, from a young age, going through cycles of depression, where I would dip into this place just feeling like who I was not worth anything, that life wasn't worth living, that there was a pointlessness to human existence. And I would dip so far into that for so long, and then would get angry with myself, get driven, and go to a different phase of just trying something new, trying something different to drive me out of the pattern. So I would get angry with life, angry with the people around me, angry at myself, and then normally some different phase of life would carry me for a little while, like a different sport, a different interest as I get older, a different business. And so this sort of pattern, this kind of sweeping into depression and then forcing myself out of it without really realizing that I was suffering from depression. Because my mother had suffered from depression. I was first diagnosed aged 16, and I was told that I had circumstantial depression. So it was based on the pressure that I was experiencing in life. And basically the diagnosis was kind of like well, your mother had depression, so of course you'd have depression. This is a genetic inheritance. And hearing that, my brain just shut down. And I refused to accept the diagnosis and go into an angry phase again, and determined internally that whatever I was going through was not depression, because I was not like my mum. She would lock herself in a bedroom and would disappear for ages, was collapsed and on a cocktail of drugs, and I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't like her. So I lived in this cyclical denial for years. And then in my early mid-30s, my coping mechanisms became overwhelmed, so the normal cycles became amplified. First of all, my father was diagnosed with, well, he had a heart attack and triple bypass surgery and could barely work. And then shortly afterwards, I think it was about a month after he'd had his first heart attack, my mum was diagnosed with terminal breast cancer. So she was in her early 50s at this time. And there was something unspoken. Our family didn't have the coping mechanisms to deal with illness and with the looming possibility of death. And so we did what we normally did in our family, which was pretend that everything was okay. Pretend that things would turn out for the best, that if we kept the British stiff upper lip that we'd be fine, that if we just kind of, supported each other on a practical level, that we'd be okay as a family. We lived in denial of the dread, of the anguish, of the grief that we were feeling internally. And so Mum eventually died. She was diagnosed to have 5 years left to live, and it was almost like somebody put a stopwatch on her. She died 5 years later. Dad was still not functioning properly. We worked in a business together, and with the dysfunction around not being able to grieve, not being able to handle the intense emotionality of the whole family circumstance, I became less and less functional and was running the family business in worse and worse ways, more and more desperate ways. I would plunge into deeper depression, try and drive myself out, and in the driving, take reckless action, desperate action. And so the businesses started to kind of crack and fall apart. And eventually, it was like my whole life began to come undone at the seams through the deepening of the swings into depression. Business collapsed. My marriage came apart when I had an 18-month-old son and headed for divorce. So Mum gone, Dad seriously ill, no income. My dad now without an income because the business has failed. All my responsibility, plus realizing that the marriage I was in was not the marriage that I wanted, was not a sustainable marriage with an 18-month-old son, was devastating. And so my normal coping mechanisms of kind of, swinging into depression, driving myself out, they just went haywire. They weren't enough to cope with the magnitude of what was taking place in my life. And I completely unraveled, became totally dysfunctional. Was eventually guided to a psychiatrist who said, well, of course, this is in your family, so it's genetic. And then, by the way, you've got a mental illness called depression. You've actually got chemical depression, so we need to rebalance the chemicals in your brain, and you need to take these drugs. Now, I'd gone to see this guy because he was a psychiatrist known for not prescribing drugs. After seeing me for, I think it would have been about 20 minutes, where he read out a list of, I think it was 27 questions, and I answered yes to every one of them. He said, well, you've got chemical depression, you need to take these drugs, and just sent me away with a prescription for Prozac and diazepam, temazepam. So Prozac, the SSRI, messed with your serotonin type drug. The other two uppers and downers because I wasn't sleeping. And he said, you've got it's chemical depression, it's anxiety based, so you've got anxiety in the mix. And I thought, oh no shit. So I went on drugs for several months, and the experience was pretty extreme. I mean, weaning myself onto them was extremely painful, massively disruptive. I felt like I was on a roller coaster inside a Pandora's box of kind of mischief and I don't know how you describe it, like your worst dreams. And then that stabilized, but I felt like I was not at home in my own body. I felt disassociated, almost like it was someone else's life taking place. And it was at that point when a friend came to me and he said, I've booked you a therapy. And I said, what is it? He said, no clue, but it's going to cost you in sterling £200, so 240 euros. And I said, okay. I had no belief that it was going to do me any good. I had no faith that it would cure anything. And I turned up for a private therapy in the very, very early days of Journey Work. And for the first time in my life, sat down and was asked, well, you know, what are you feeling? And I could vaguely describe what I was feeling, although it was disassociated. The first time ever, someone said, okay, great, just feel that. It didn't quite make sense internally, although there was a relief with the invitation, because I realized that I wasn't being asked to fight it, to fix it, to make it right. I was just being invited to feel exactly what was there in that moment. And got guided into a very early version of an emotional drop-through, which is one of the foundation pieces of the journey, where you just stop and you open, you actually stop analyzing, you stop making pictures, stop telling yourself stories, and you simply, in an almost, in a visceral way, in an almost animal way, feel what is next. If you were to feel the sorrow, feel the sadness, then what happens if you allow all that to take place? And I found myself sinking deeper and deeper into more and more profound emotions. Some of them very intense, some of them overwhelming. I came to anger and rage at one point, and it felt like anger was going to just burst out of me. This is not cathartic. This is not, you beat pillars and yell it out. It was just a complete acceptance and a welcome of the actual emotion that was there. I fell into fear and terror. Same thing. Beautiful. Just feel that. If you welcomed it all, what's even deeper than this? And eventually, dropping down through different emotions like this, I came to a place of complete blackness. And again, same thing. So what if you just welcomed it? So what if you stopped the fight? What if you really surrendered into reality as it's showing up? And eventually came to a point where I just said, well, death is next. And the beautiful words came back. So, are you willing to experience death? Are you willing simply to let go no matter what? And I tried so many things at this point in life. I had done all sorts of different modalities that hadn't ultimately worked. And I thought, well, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die, and I'm willing to let go. And so I let go into the face of death. And in that letting go, it felt like some construct of self, some notion of me, of who I am. Definitely the physicality of me just dissolved, kind of melted, faded, until there was a profound stillness, a nothing, an absolute universal emptiness. And the same words came. So beautiful. If you were to welcome all of that, it's like, in this point, what's in the heart of this? What's in the core of this? And in letting go into complete nothing beyond death, the realization was shattering that in the heart of everything that I'd been fighting all my life, there was light. And it was like light started to come through the darkness. Not at the end of a tunnel, but as the implicit quality of darkness itself. And I fell into an experience of self that was so profound that I absolutely knew that depression was not even available to me from that moment. That in letting go of the fight, in letting go of the story, in letting go of trying to be someone better than I'd imagined myself to be, in trying to shore myself up, in trying to protect myself, I'd caused the biggest problems in my life. And the antidote was radical in its simplicity. Just stop. Just open. Just feel until those feelings are done with you. I came out of the session and I knew that depression was no longer a part of my life. This took about 2.25 hours. And I could barely say a thank you. It must have been very cursory. I felt almost mute with the profound realization that everything I'd been looking for in my life I'd found to be already present. Deep inside me, everything I wanted was already here. I went back to my home that night, went to the medication cabinet, and my body just went, you don't need those drugs. And I was too scared to not take them. I'd always been told, if you ever get off this medication, we'll negotiate a weaning off over a period of 6 months, and that's if you come to that point. And I knew my body didn't want them. And so I took a half dose that night, went back to the bathroom cabinet the next night, and please don't tell your readers to do this, please do not. I flushed them down the toilet. I knew that not just that my body didn't want them, but it couldn't tolerate them anymore. Going cold turkey like that is not something I would recommend. It was immensely painful for about 3 weeks to go through the detox, the weaning off the drugs. But even through the pain, even through the shakes and the shudders you get when you go cold turkey that quickly, I knew that I was whole, that I was complete, that I was good in my own skin, good in my own body. And depression has not been a part of my life since that time. It just left. And of course, I went back to Brandon and said, look, I've got huge gratitude for the work here. Can I please support you? Can I do anything to help you get the work out? Because people need to find out this truth, this more than a technique, this truth in themselves. And so started to work with her. And of course I was doing clean-up work with Journey Work as time went on. But the truth is, from that time, that was in very late 1994, that I have not experienced a moment of depression since that time. I've experienced some intense emotions, but with the understanding, with the knowledge that if I stop and quietly just open and welcome whatever shows up in life to be here, the emotions can pass through. The body sometimes shakes like you see animals shaking. If you see like a safari film of a lion chasing a zebra or an antelope, if the prey escapes and the lion withdraws, you'll see the animal stop and it will shake as if the chemistry of the emotionality is resolving in the body. And so the body sometimes shakes in this sort of way. But what it feels like is that the traumas of the past are actually beginning to release in this way, that the stuck chemistry that we've created inside us from the holding on or the overriding of old emotions allows itself to free. And my life has been, since that time, the exact opposite emotionally of what it was before. It was constipated at best emotionally previously. I felt kind of stuck, mostly in the grey zone, sometimes worse, sometimes a little bit better, but I felt dissatisfied with life. I felt like something was missing, that I was looking for something that I could never find. And from the day on, I've woken up every morning grateful to be alive, feeling like I've got a purpose in life, feeling whole inside myself, feeling just damn blessed and grateful to be alive and to take the next breath. So what we're writing about, pointing at, offering with the book is not any analysis. It's not saying this is taking place in your brain chemistry. It's not my belief. When I stopped taking the drugs after doing Journey Work, my brain chemistry resolved itself. As soon as the drugs are out of my system, my brain knew what to do to be healthy. It was just the emotional imbalance that I was experiencing in life previously was disrupting my brain's ability to produce healthy chemistry. With emotional health, no problem with physical health. So it's not a medical book, it's not an analytical book, it's not a textbook about depression. Neither is it one of these books that teaches you how to change your mood for a short period of time. Because there are a lot of those books out there which are saying, if you do this and you take this action and you think these thoughts, then you can make your life happier. And that can work for some people in the short run. In my experience, years ago, trying that type of approach was that it had a short-term positive effect that at best didn't last, And at worst, truthfully, ended up leaving me in a worse place than I'd started off. It was like I built my expectations up even more. And when those expectations didn't mature as I expected them to be, the next crisis point that I hit in life would take me lower than previously. So this is not a book like that. It's a book written based on Brandon's direct experience of healing naturally from a large tumor, from my experience of healing from depression. And it's a book that we're both hoping is going to be used around the world as a workbook, as a set of tools to get into the root system of depression, into the actual causes of depression, and lift those roots out. We're hoping that people will use it to truly free themselves completely from the condition. There are a couple of points around this to be really clear with our take on depression. And again, this is not a theoretical take, it's a take that's born from working with many thousands of people over the last 23, 24 years with journey work. The first thing is that depression is not in itself a mental illness. I'm thrilled to see that depression is getting more press these days and that it's become less of a taboo and more a subject that can be talked about. What is disappointing to me is that mostly, I would say almost entirely, it gets labelled as a mental illness. It is not a mental illness. It can cause mental illness, but at the core of depression, if you want to define it, it's not that. It's not a physical disease. I've heard it laid out in that way. There is no evidence, no credible scientific evidence for labelling this condition with either of those labels, mental illness, physical disease. The pharmaceutical companies have got a vested interest in skewing our perception in certain ways. And there's a tradition over the last 40, 50 years in the medical profession of labelling depression in certain ways because that is the way they're trained. It's handed on from generation to generation. I've got friends who are medical doctors and I've talked to them about it and they've said, well, we prescribe drugs because that is what we're trained to do. We see their limited effect, we see their disparate effect, but that is what we're trained to do. And I've said, okay, great, there was a point in my life when they may have done me some good, I don't know, but they're definitely not the answer, and I think most people recognize that. Depression is not a genetic inevitability. I won't go into the genetic research on that, but it is not a genetic inevitability. Obviously, there are tendencies that can be passed on in families, a tendency to behave and to be conditioned in certain ways. But the fact that your mother or grandmother or grandfather had depression does not mean that you or the progeny will suffer from depression. And then last, depression is not an emotion. Depression, as Brandon was describing from her personal story, is very different from a clean emotion which can pass through your body very quickly. If you open with any named clean, clear emotion, so precise emotion in other words, it will pass through your body in a relatively short period of time, mostly within a matter of minutes, certainly within 10 or 15 minutes, any acute emotion will pass through and will leave you feeling the next and the next.